Hey there. Today, I'm going to ask a very interesting question that I asked some of my students and talk about their answers and my answers, which is, what is the most important cellular organelle? Okay, so to answer that question, we need to do a couple of things. First of all, we need to make sure we have some concept of what we're talking about with cellular organelles. So there are cells. Let me draw a couple of different cells here. So we might have a big fat animal cell. We might have a big square plant cell. Thump. We might have a much smaller bacteria cell. So these first two are eukaryotes, meaning that they each have inside of them some kind of nucleus containing genetic material, nucleus. The prokaryote contains genetic material, but it does not put it in a location. It's just kind of throughout. So there we go, genetic material. What are some of the other organelles that these different organisms have? Well, all of them have what are known as ribosomes, which are little tiny protein producing machines. So there are little tiny protein producing machines in all three cells. They all have the membrane as noted when I drew them, although the plant cell also has a cell wall, which is why it is more square structuring it. And then in these ones that have the nucleus, there's not only these little tiny protein producing machines, but there's also some sort of membrane related runways in which these proteins can travel, called the endoplasmic reticulum. There's two parts of that. There's the rough part where the ribosomes are and the smooth part, and different things happen in each of them, but these are locations that you will find proteins travel by. And then at the end of those locations is typically a thing called a Golgi apparatus, and that'll be in both of these, that causes things to be able to leave the cell. It produces little vesicles, which causes things to go in and out. Things can still leave the cell in the prokaryotes, and the proteins can still be made. They just don't travel down specific paths, and they're not specifically associated with these edges of membrane, although if they're sometimes produced by the ribosomes into the membrane, they'll go into the membrane. A couple other useful things. Both the plant and the animal cells have mitochondria. So mitochondria are the powerhouses of the cell. So they produce the energy. They take oxygen and sugar and turn it into energy. In the case of the animal cell, both the oxygen and the sugar have to come externally. In the case of the plant cell, don't forget, plants also have chloroplasts, which take water and carbon dioxide, both of which are surrounding the plant, and turn them into oxygen and sugar. And that's most of the main components. So in looking at those, you say, well, which one is most important? Well, most people think, especially if you've learned a little bit of science before, that the most important component of these cells is clearly in the nucleus or the genetic material, the fancy DNA that controls the blueprint to our entire lives and everything that our cells do, right? And in fact, that is what a lot of my students will say, is that it's got to be the DNA. And we used to think that DNA was the key thing. And there are a couple of reasons, because if you switch DNA to another cell that has other stuff, the DNA can then redirect that cell to change what it's doing and things like that. So it kind of acts like a brain. Except interestingly enough, all of the DNA blueprints what's happening. It doesn't always follow through. So for instance, if you take the nucleus out of both of these spots, if I just immediately were to suck out and remove this nucleus, kaboom, does that kill the cell immediately? The answer, interestingly enough, is no. The cell actually will continue to function. Things that are already made are made, energy continues to be produced, proteins continue to activate, and all of the other stuff the cell does goes on, and they can do that for a surprisingly long time. And in fact, some of the most important cells in your body, which are the red blood cells that carry the oxygen for the mitochondria to use throughout the body, don't even have a nucleus. They're created, and then they go off and they do their job. So it is a blueprint, but is it the most important? I'm not sure. I just read a book not that long ago by Bruce Lipton. Probably should get these things right when I say them, called The Biology of Belief. And in that, it talks a little bit more about how different things, Bruce Lipton, how different things might control that. And he's very focused on the cell membrane. So he very much likes to think about the membrane, the outside of the cell, as the key component. So he says everything comes from the environment and it comes into the membrane. And when it comes into the membrane, that's what changes what happens. And that also factors in with the idea that although your DNA has the blueprint, it only has the blueprint for not quite 20,000 genes. And your body performs hundreds of thousands of functions from those genes. So clearly there's something else involved. And there is actually something else involved. It is called epigenetics. Epigenetics. Epi meaning above genetics. So it's over it and it has control over it. So how do we even know from the blueprint which genes to tell to do their job or not? And how do we know how to make them work? Well, that's epigenetics, signals that come in via the cell membrane, typically from the environment, that tell them to do that. And interestingly enough, over here in our fancy bacteria that doesn't even have a nucleus, signals from the environment are indeed a key concept. But you see now, whereas I like this idea that environmental things are involved, I still don't think that's actually the most important. If you ask me what's the most important, I think it's these little guys, the ribosomes, because they make the proteins. So why does Bruce Lipton think the membrane is important? Because it has receptors that pick up on environmental signals. So the membrane is made out of lipids, but the receptors in the membrane are made out of proteins. A protein can be produced from a bit of DNA. And actually, a string of amino acids can be produced from a bit of DNA and then be reshifted into 2 or 3 different kinds of proteins, depending on how other proteins interact with it. The creation of proteins is what gives you hundreds of thousands of functions out of less than 20,000 genes. Proteins is what causes the cell wall to function. Proteins are what is inside the mitochondria, the enzymes that cause the reactions that allow for the energy to be produced. Proteins do just about everything, and they are key. So therefore, if you ask me what's the most important thing, it's definitely the ribosomes. They produce the proteins that receive the outside signals. They produce the proteins that cause the reactions in the body. They even produce the proteins that tell the DNA it's time to transcribe. So ribosomes are my clear winner for the best organelle, although there isn't really an answer to this. Obviously, cells need all of these things to live and survive. But I will note, of the things that exist only in prokaryotic cells with no nucleus and no extended stuff, they always have ribosomes. All right, I think that was interesting. What do you think is the best cellular organelle? Do you agree with me? Do you agree with Lipton, or do you agree with my students? Or are you going to argue for something else, like maybe a mitochondria? Hard to do anything without energy. All right, have fun.